476 AD. The doors of the imperial palace swing open for the last time. A boy dressed in a purple robe, barely 16 years old, watches as a barbarian general walks toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Outside, the streets of Ravenna, the last western capital, go about their business as though nothing unusual is happening at all, because to most of the people living there, nothing unusual really is. That boy's name is Romulus Augustulus, and within minutes he will no longer be Emperor of Rome. There will be no epic battle, no heroic last stand, no soldier willing to raise a sword in his defense, no crowd gathered outside the palace gates weeping for the fall of an empire. The last representative of an empire that had ruled the known world for over 1,000 years will simply be stripped of his crown like an afterthought. A paperwork formality with no real weight behind it, handled with less ceremony than a routine change of local governor. But wait, how did we get here? How is it possible that the most powerful civilization in human history, the one that ruled 3 continents for centuries, that built roads still in use today, that gave us laws we still follow, collapsed like a sandcastle at the edge of the tide? The answer does not live in that single afternoon in 476. It lives much further back, in invisible cracks that formed over generations, in decisions that seemed insignificant at the time but that, stacked one on top of the other, eventually brought down everything Rome had built. And if you stay with us to the end of this video, you will understand something most history books never quite manage to explain properly. The fall of Rome was not an accident. It was a warning. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep, researched history is what you come here for, subscribe to Deep History Origins and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Let's go back to the moment when Rome still seemed untouchable. Part 1. The world that seemed eternal. Picture yourself as a Roman citizen, somewhere in the 2nd century AD. You are walking through the streets of the capital of the world, and everywhere you look, the city seems built to outlast time itself. The Colosseum thunders with the roar of 50,000 spectators on any given afternoon. The baths of Caracalla shimmer with steam and marble, where thousands of ordinary citizens bathe, read, gossip, and strike business deals beneath ceilings covered in mosaic. The Roman Forum sits at the beating heart of an empire that stretches from the cold, wet shores of Britain all the way to the scorching sand of Egypt, from the mountain passes of Spain to the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia. Everywhere you look carries the unmistakable mark of Rome. Your legions have not lost a major war in living memory. Your language is the language of trade, law, and power across 3 continents. Your civilization does not just dominate the world. In your own mind, it defines what it even means to be civilized at all. Walk a little further, and the sheer scale of the place keeps announcing itself. Grain ships from Egypt unload at the port of Ostia by the thousands each year, feeding a city whose population dwarfs anything else on the planet. Aqueducts stride across the countryside on stone arches, carrying fresh water from mountains dozens of kilometers away, straight into public fountains, private villas, and the enormous bathing complexes where citizens of every class mingle daily. Along the Appian Way and roads like it, merchants, soldiers, messengers, and pilgrims move constantly between provinces that would take a modern traveller days to cross by car, using a road network so well engineered that some of it is still, remarkably, drivable today. A letter posted in Britain can reach Rome in a matter of weeks. A legal dispute in Syria can be settled according to the same body of law that governs a property claim in Spain. For an ordinary citizen standing in the Forum on an ordinary afternoon, the idea that any of this could ever meaningfully end would have sounded less like history and more like a bad joke. So what could possibly go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything. Here is the uncomfortable truth this video is built around. Rome was already sick, quietly and invisibly, long before a single barbarian ever knocked on its gates. The first real symptoms appeared during what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a brutal, chaotic stretch of roughly 50 years, from 235 to 284 AD, that very nearly tore the empire apart from the inside before a single foreign army ever needed to try. During those 5 decades, more than 50 different men claimed the title of emperor. Some held the throne for years. Others held it for weeks, sometimes days. Most of them were murdered by their own soldiers, victims of an endless, grinding cycle of betrayal, bribery, and civil war that left the entire machinery of the Roman state permanently, structurally weakened. At the crisis's darkest point, the empire did not simply suffer from weak leadership. It nearly stopped being one empire altogether. In the West, a breakaway state known to modern historians as the Gallic Empire declared itself independent under its own self-proclaimed emperors, controlling Gaul, Britain, and Spain for over a decade, while Rome proved powerless to stop it. In the East, at almost exactly the same time, the wealthy caravan city of Palmyra, under its formidable queen Zenobia, carved out its own breakaway empire stretching across Egypt, Syria, and much of Asia Minor. For a brief, genuinely stunning period in the early 270s, the Roman Empire existed as three separate, rival states simultaneously, each claiming legitimacy, each minting its own coins, each commanding its own loyal army. It took the soldier emperor Aurelian, ruling for only 5 years before his own assassination, to forcibly reunite all three fragments through a series of brutal, decisive campaigns, a feat so remarkable that grateful contemporaries gave him the title Restorer of the World. That the empire needed restoring at all, barely 200 years after Augustus first founded it, tells you everything about how close to total fragmentation Rome had already come, over a full 2 centuries before Odoacer ever set foot in Ravenna. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. To really understand how Rome fell, we first need to understand what actually made it great in the first place. And the answer here is not what most people expect walking into this story. It was not simply military power, although Rome's legions were, for centuries, genuinely formidable. It was not engineering genius alone either, though the aqueducts, the roads, and the bridges Roman engineers built 2,000 years ago are, remarkably, still standing today. The true secret behind Rome's success was something far more subtle, far less discussed, and far more interesting: its ability to absorb. Rome did not simply conquer peoples and grind them under its heel the way so many empires before and after it chose to do. Rome turned conquered peoples into Romans. A Gaul, a Spaniard, a Syrian, an Egyptian. Any of them could, in time, become a Roman citizen, participate in Roman politics, serve proudly in the legions, and in some remarkable cases, even rise all the way to the imperial throne itself. That was Rome's true gift to the ancient world, transforming yesterday's enemies into tomorrow's partners, generation after generation, for the better part of 500 years. This process reached its logical extreme in 212 AD, when the Emperor Caracalla issued an edict granting full Roman citizenship to nearly every free person living anywhere inside the empire's borders, regardless of ethnicity, language, or homeland. Overnight, millions of people who had previously been subjects of Rome became, at least on paper, full Romans themselves. It was, in one sense, an extraordinary act of inclusion unmatched by any comparable ancient power. In another sense, though, it also meant that Roman identity itself had become so broad, so universal, that it started to lose some of the specific, unifying weight it had once carried. Being Roman, by the 3rd century, no longer automatically meant sharing a single language, a single set of ancestral gods, or a single sense of shared history the way it once had for the citizens of the Old Republic. But that same extraordinary strength would, eventually, become Rome's greatest weakness. Because while Rome kept absorbing new peoples into itself at an astonishing rate, it was also, slowly and almost invisibly, diluting its own core identity. The legions that had once been filled almost entirely with Italian citizens loyal to the Old Republic were, by the later imperial period, packed instead with Germanic soldiers, Thracians, Syrians, men who fought first and foremost for a paycheck, not for any deep, inherited loyalty to the idea of Rome itself. And right there, in that quiet, almost unnoticeable shift, the very first seed of eventual destruction was planted, decades before anyone in the capital would think to worry about it. The change showed up on the battlefield itself, not just in the ranks. The old Republican Legion had been built around heavy infantry, citizen soldiers marching in tight, disciplined formation, armed with the short stabbing sword and the large rectangular shield, trained to grind down enemies through sheer coordinated endurance. By the 4th and 5th centuries, that model had shifted considerably towards smaller, more mobile units, heavier reliance on cavalry, and a growing dependence on barbarian auxiliary troops, who often fought in their own traditional style rather than the old Roman way. None of this made the later Roman army weak by definition. Some of these later formations were genuinely effective, adapting sensibly to new threats like fast-moving Hunnic horse archers that the old legionary formation had never been designed to counter. But it did mean that the deep, almost religious connection between Roman citizenship and Roman military service, the idea that defending Rome was every citizen's shared duty, not simply a job some paid specialist did on your behalf, had quietly, thoroughly dissolved by the time the empire needed that connection most. So when did the actual decline begin? Some historians point to the year 180 AD, when the Emperor Marcus Aurelius finally died after decades of steady philosophical rule. He was the last of what ancient writers later called the 5 good emperors, a run of philosopher kings who governed, by and large, with wisdom, restraint, and a genuine sense of public duty. Even his own death carried a warning sign most people miss entirely. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his final decade on the frontier, not writing philosophy and comfort, but personally commanding legions against Germanic tribes along the Danube, fighting a war that never seemed to have a clean, final ending. Behind that frontier war sat something even more dangerous than any Germanic army, a devastating pandemic, now known to historians as the Antonine Plague, swept through the empire during Marcus Aurelius's reign, likely carried home by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. Ancient sources describe entire towns emptied out within weeks. Modern estimates suggest the plague may have killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the empire, a staggering loss for any pre-modern society to absorb, let alone one already stretched thin defending thousands of kilometers of frontier. The legions themselves were hit hard, and replacing trained, experienced soldiers took years the empire simply did not have to spare. His son, Commodus, was the complete opposite in almost every conceivable way. A vain, unstable megalomaniac who genuinely believed himself to be the living reincarnation of Hercules, Commodus preferred fighting half-tame animals in the gladiatorial arena to the tedious business of actually running an empire. His disastrous reign blew the doors wide open on the chaos that followed. After his assassination in 192 AD, Rome plunged headfirst into a brutal civil war that revealed a terrifying truth the empire could never fully unlearn afterward. The throne of Rome, it turned out, was ultimately bought and held with swords, not legitimacy, not bloodline, not the will of the Senate or the people. But the real crisis, the one that came dangerously close to splitting the empire into pieces for good, arrived in the middle of the 3rd century. Picture the situation Rome actually faced by then. The empire's frontiers stretched for literally thousands of kilometers, from Hadrian's Wall in the cold north of Britain, all the way to the burning deserts of Mesopotamia in the east. Defending borders on that scale required massive standing armies. Massive standing armies, in turn, cost absolutely staggering sums of money, year after year, with no end in sight. Meanwhile, the Roman economy itself was already wobbling badly under the strain. The empire's gold and silver mines, worked hard for centuries, were slowly running dry. The currency was being devalued again and again by desperate emperors trying to stretch a shrinking treasury across an expanding list of obligations. Facing armies that demanded to be paid on time, or they simply stopped fighting, emperors ordered coin after coin, minted with less and less actual precious metal inside it. A silver coin that had contained roughly 95% real silver back in the 1st century AD contained barely 5% silver by the height of the 3rd century crisis. The result was entirely predictable and entirely catastrophic. Runaway inflation. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed almost overnight in some regions. Trade across the empire ground to a slow, painful halt. Cities that had once been wealthy centers of commerce grew visibly, undeniably poorer with each passing decade. One emperor, Aurelian, tried to address the currency crisis head-on in the 270s, issuing a new coinage explicitly marked with its silver content to try to rebuild public trust in Roman money after decades of quiet debasement. It helped for a while. It did not undo the underlying damage. Once ordinary people across the empire had learned, through hard experience, that the coin in their hand today might buy noticeably less bread tomorrow than it had yesterday, that lesson proved almost impossible to fully unlearn, and the empire's monetary credibility never entirely recovered, even under later, more stable emperors. And while Rome bled out economically from the inside, its enemies outside the borders were only getting stronger. To the north, Germanic tribes that had once been little more than an occasional, manageable nuisance were now organizing themselves into far larger, far more dangerous confederations. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Alemanni, names that meant almost nothing to an ordinary Roman citizen in the year 200, would, within a single lifetime, come to terrorize the entire Roman world from end to end. Persian ambition added pressure from the opposite direction. To the east, meanwhile, the Sassanid Persian Empire surged back into aggressive relevance, reclaiming territory Rome had long considered permanently, comfortably its own. Then, in 260 AD, something happened that no Roman alive had ever imagined could happen. The Emperor Valerian was captured alive by the Persians in battle. It was the first time in the entire history of Rome that a sitting emperor had been taken prisoner by a foreign enemy, and the humiliation that followed was total and complete. According to surviving ancient chronicles, the Persian king Shapur I reportedly used the captured Valerian as a literal human footstool, stepping on the emperor's back whenever he needed to mount his horse in public. When the emperor finally died in captivity, his skin was, according to several ancient sources, flayed from his body and displayed inside a Persian temple as a grim trophy of conquest. Think for a moment about what that single image actually meant to the Roman psyche. The emperor, a man Romans had been raised from childhood to regard as something close to a living god, reduced to a mocking prop in a foreign temple. Rome's carefully cultivated image of total invincibility was shattered in that one moment, and it would never fully recover. Behind the battlefield humiliations sat a quieter, less dramatic crisis that historians often struggle to make cinematic, but that mattered just as much in the long run. Local city governments across the empire had traditionally been run by a class of wealthy landowners called curiales, who were personally responsible, under Roman law, for guaranteeing that their city met its tax quota to the imperial treasury, even if that meant paying the shortfall out of their own pocket in a bad year. As the 3rd century's chaos dragged on, this became an increasingly unbearable burden. Wealthy families began doing everything in their power to escape curial obligations entirely, bribing officials, fleeing to the countryside, or seeking exemptions through the church once Christianity gained imperial favor. Fewer willing curiales meant less reliable local government. Less reliable local government meant weaker roads, weaker courts, weaker public order, at exactly the moment the empire could least afford any of it. It was corrosion happening in thousands of small, unglamorous ways, in city council chambers across 3 continents, completely invisible to anyone watching only for barbarian armies on the horizon. Part 2. A broken empire learns to split itself in two. Then came Diocletian, a Dalmatian soldier of genuinely humble origins who clawed his way up through the ranks of the legions and seized the imperial throne in 284 AD. At the exact moment the empire desperately needed someone willing to make brutal, unsentimental decisions. Diocletian understood something no emperor before him had ever been willing to openly admit. The empire, in its current form, was simply too large for any single man to effectively govern, defend, or even fully understand. His solution was genuinely radical for its time. He split the empire in half, east and west, each half given its own emperor and its own junior co-ruler known as a Caesar. This system, later called the Tetrarchy, actually worked reasonably well for a while. Diocletian stabilized runaway inflation as best he could, reformed the tax system and the army's structure, and restored a real, tangible degree of order after decades of chaos. His economic fix, though, was heavy-handed in ways that reveal just how desperate the situation had become. In 301 AD, Diocletian issued his famous edict on maximum prices, an empire-wide attempt to freeze the cost of everything from wheat and wine to shoes and shipping fees, backed by the threat of execution for anyone caught overcharging. It failed almost immediately. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at a loss. Black markets sprang up everywhere the edict was actually enforced, and within a few years the whole scheme was quietly abandoned. It stands, even now, as one of history's earliest and most instructive lessons in exactly what happens when a government tries to legislate its way out of an inflation crisis rather than fixing the underlying cause. Diocletian's reign carried a darker legacy as well. Convinced that Rome's traditional gods had abandoned the empire during the 3rd century's chaos, and increasingly suspicious of a fast-growing religious minority that refused to honor the old state cults, he launched what later Christian writers would call the Great Persecution in 303 AD, a brutal, empire-wide campaign of arrests, torture, and executions aimed at Christians who would not renounce their faith. It was the single most severe persecution Christianity had ever faced, and it utterly failed to slow the religion's growth. If anything, the stories of martyrs who died rather than recant only strengthened the faith's appeal in the decades that followed, setting the stage for an entirely different emperor to make a very different bet on the very same religion. But in doing so, he also institutionalized the division. Rome was no longer, in any functional sense, one single political entity. It was now two separate halves that would, over time, drift down two entirely different historical paths. And this is exactly where the story starts to get genuinely fascinating, because while the Western Roman Empire slowly, painfully fell apart over the following 2 centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire did the exact opposite. It flourished. Constantinople, the new eastern capital founded by the Emperor Constantine in 330 AD, on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, rapidly became one of the richest, best-defended cities in the entire ancient world. Constantine's own rise to power tells its own remarkable story about how thoroughly Rome's political and religious identity was already shifting beneath the surface. He seized sole control of the empire after defeating his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, a victory he later credited to a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky the night before. Whatever actually happened on that battlefield, the political consequences were enormous. Constantine legalized Christianity throughout the empire the following year, and in 325 AD he personally convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the Roman world to hammer out a unified Christian doctrine under direct imperial sponsorship. A religion that Diocletian had tried to exterminate by force just 2 decades earlier was now, remarkably, receiving the direct patronage of the emperor himself. Few single reversals in Roman history capture the empire's underlying instability quite so vividly. Constantine's nephew Julian would later try to reverse this shift entirely, briefly reviving the old pagan cults and earning the nickname Julian the Apostate from Christian writers for his trouble. His attempt died with him on a Persian battlefield in 363 AD, after barely 2 years on the throne. Christianity's momentum by that point had already become effectively unstoppable across the empire. While Rome decayed piece by piece, Constantinople genuinely shone, protected by triple walls, deep coffers, and a far more defensible geographic position. The division between the two halves was never merely political or economic either. It ran deeper than that, cultural, linguistic, even spiritual. The West continued to speak Latin as its everyday language. The East increasingly spoke Greek. The West clung tightly to its old, familiar Roman traditions. The East embraced Christianity with a deep, almost mystical intensity that would eventually reshape its entire political identity. Two halves of a single empire that still technically shared one name, but that had less and less in common with every single passing decade. If you're enjoying this deep dive so far, this is a genuinely good moment to hit subscribe. Documentaries like this one take real research, real time, and real dedication to put together properly, and every single subscriber helps keep this channel able to keep making them. Now, let's talk about the barbarians, because this is exactly where you and I need to sit down together and tear apart a very popular, very durable historical myth. Part 3. The myth of the barbarian horde. When most people picture the fall of Rome in their heads, they imagine savage hordes sweeping violently across the landscape, torching libraries, smashing statues, and single-handedly extinguishing an entire civilization in one dramatic, fiery night. It is admittedly a genuinely dramatic image. It also happens to be almost entirely wrong, and the real story underneath it is far more complicated and, in a strange, quiet way, far more tragic. The barbarians did not destroy Rome from the outside. Rome, in a very real sense, invited them in from the inside, one recruitment drive at a time. Here is how it actually happened. By the late 4th century, the Roman legions were composed, in significant part, of Germanic soldiers. These men were not prisoners of war, and they were not enslaved conscripts dragged unwillingly into service. They were allied warriors, known formally in Latin as foederati, who served the Roman state in direct exchange for land grants and steady pay. Many of the single most powerful generals of Rome's final century were themselves of barbarian origin, holding real command over Roman armies. Stilicho, the man who effectively ran the entire Western Empire for years as its supreme military commander, was half Vandal by birth. Ricimer, the so-called kingmaker of the 5th century who personally installed and deposed a string of puppet emperors, was of Visigothic descent through his mother's line. And Odoacer, the very man who would ultimately depose the last Western emperor in 476, was himself a Germanic mercenary who had spent his entire adult life serving loyally inside the Roman army before that final, decisive act. Do you see the deep irony sitting right at the center of this story? Rome did not, in the end, fall to some purely external invasion sweeping in from the outside. It collapsed largely from within, consumed slowly by its own structural dependence on the very peoples it had once proudly claimed to have conquered and civilized. Stilicho's own story ends up illustrating that irony almost perfectly. For nearly 2 decades, he held the Western Empire together, almost single-handedly, defeating a massive Gothic invasion led by Radagaisus in 405 and 406, when a horde reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands crossed into Italy itself. He won that campaign decisively, and yet, in a court increasingly gripped by paranoia about barbarian generals wielding too much real power, Stilicho was accused of secretly conspiring with Rome's enemies, arrested on the orders of the very emperor he had spent his career protecting, and executed in 408 AD. His death removed the one man capable of holding the crumbling frontier together, and it happened less than 2 years before Alaric's Visigoths finally marched on Rome itself. The same winter, Stilicho was busy destroying Radagaisus's army in Italy. An entirely different, far less contained crisis was already unfolding hundreds of kilometers to the north. On the last day of 406 AD, with the frozen Rhine River acting as the empire's last real defensive barrier, a massive coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed into Roman Gaul largely unopposed, since the frontier legions that should have been guarding that stretch of river had already been pulled south to help fight Radagaisus instead. That single crossing effectively tore open the entire western frontier for good. Within a few short years, these same tribes had pushed all the way through Gaul and into Spain, eventually crossing further still into North Africa itself, setting the stage for the eventual loss of the empire's grain supply decades later. The decisive final blow, though, came from somewhere else entirely. It came from the Huns. These fast-moving nomadic warriors from the eastern steppes, eventually led by the fearsome Attila, had absolutely no interest whatsoever in becoming Roman themselves. They wanted to raid, they wanted to plunder, they wanted to terrorize anyone unlucky enough to stand between them and easy wealth. Their sudden, violent arrival in the region during the late 4th and early 5th centuries set off a chain reaction that Rome, in its weakened state, simply could not survive intact. Long before Attila ever turned his attention toward Gaul and the battle that would eventually stop him, he had already spent years terrorizing the Eastern Roman Empire's own territory in the Balkans, sacking dozens of cities and extracting enormous annual tribute payments from Constantinople, simply to keep his armies from advancing further. Contemporary writers described him, with genuine dread, as the scourge of God, a divine punishment sent to chastise a sinful world, and the sheer psychological terror his name carried across the empire was, in its own way, as damaging as any single battlefield defeat. By the time the Western general Aetius finally confronted him at the Catalonian plains, Attila was not some unknown threat appearing out of nowhere. He was already, by reputation alone, the single most feared man alive anywhere in the ancient world. The Goths, genuinely terrified by the Huns pushing hard against them from the east, begged the Roman emperor for permission to cross the frontier and take refuge inside the safety of the empire's own borders. The Emperor Valens agreed to let them in, believing, wrongly, that he could manage and control such a large influx of desperate refugees. It would prove to be one of the single most catastrophic miscalculations in the entire history of Roman foreign policy. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Gothic forces, pushed past their breaking point by years of Roman corruption, broken promises, and outright mistreatment at the hands of local officials, turned violently against the very legions meant to be supervising them, and annihilated a significant portion of the Eastern Roman field army in a single afternoon. The Emperor Valens himself died somewhere on that battlefield, and his body was never recovered or identified. It stood, at the time, as the worst military defeat Rome had suffered in centuries, and it proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the legions were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. After Adrianople, everything seemed to accelerate all at once. The Visigoths, under their ambitious king Alaric, wandered restlessly through Roman territory for years, demanding land, titles, and formal recognition from a government that no longer knew quite how to say no to them. Rome tried repeatedly to buy them off, with gold, with treaties, with hollow diplomatic promises. None of it worked for very long. In 410 AD, Alaric finally ran out of patience entirely. His forces marched on the city of Rome itself and sacked it over 3 brutal days. It was the first time in nearly 800 years that the so-called Eternal City had fallen into the hands of a foreign enemy, and the psychological shockwave that followed rippled across the entire ancient world. Saint Jerome, writing from far away in the Holy Land at the time, captured the mood perfectly in a single devastating line. "My voice fails me," he wrote. "The city that conquered the world has itself been conquered." That same year, in a small but telling sign of just how thin Roman resources had become, the Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain, informing them that Rome could no longer spare troops to defend the island, and that they should look to their own defence from now on. Britain, a Roman province for well over 3 centuries by that point, was quietly, almost casually let go, not conquered, not lost in battle, simply set adrift, because the empire had run out of soldiers to spare for it. It stands as one of the clearest single moments in this entire story, where Rome's decline becomes visible not through defeat, but through simple, unglamorous absence. Alaric himself did not live long to enjoy his conquest. He died of illness later that same year, and his followers, according to a much later account, diverted an entire river to bury him in its dry bed, along with a portion of his plundered treasure, then killed the enslaved workers who had done the digging and let the river flow back over the grave, so that no one would ever find or desecrate it. Whether every detail of that story is literally true, or partly legend, it captures something real about how thoroughly the old certainties had shifted. A Gothic king was now being buried with the kind of secrecy once reserved for Roman emperors, in territory that, a century earlier, no Goth could have dreamed of setting foot in as anything but a prisoner. And yet, remarkably, even after Alaric's sack, Rome survived, battered, humiliated, deeply shaken, but still, technically, alive. The empire staggered on for another 60 years or so, like an exhausted boxer who simply refuses to stay down, no matter how many times he's already been hit. There were even genuine moments of hope scattered through those final decades. The brilliant Roman general Aetius decisively defeated Attila's massive Hunnic army at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451 AD, arguably saving the entire Western world from total, unchecked annihilation at the hands of the Huns. But even that hard-won victory came with a heavy, telling price attached to it. Aetius had relied almost entirely on barbarian allies to win the battle. Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, all fighting side by side, but not, in any real sense, for Rome itself. They fought for their own interests, their own territorial ambitions, their own future, and once the fighting was over and Attila's threat had been neutralized, they simply went right back to quietly carving up Roman territory for themselves, exactly as before. Aetius did not live long enough to enjoy his victory. The Emperor Valentinian III, apparently threatened by his own general's growing reputation, personally stabbed Aetius to death during a palace audience in 454 AD. A courtier watching the murder unfold reportedly told the emperor he had just used his right hand to cut off his left, since Aetius had been the single most capable military leader the crumbling West still had left. Valentinian himself was assassinated within the year by loyalists of the very man he had just killed. Attila, meanwhile, died on his own wedding night in 453 AD, reportedly from a severe nosebleed while heavily intoxicated, and the Hunnic confederation he had built collapsed almost overnight without him. The single most feared warlord in the ancient world was gone, undone not by Roman steel, but by his own excess. With Aetius dead and the imperial throne suddenly vacant, the Vandal king Genseric saw his opening. In 455 AD, his fleet sailed from North Africa and landed at Rome itself, and for 2 full weeks his forces systematically stripped the city of its remaining portable wealth: statues, gold, even the gilded bronze roof tiles from the Temple of Jupiter. Unlike Alaric's sack 45 years earlier, Genseric's men reportedly avoided burning buildings or mass slaughter, focused instead on methodical plunder. It hardly mattered to the people of Rome whether the men looting their city were being polite about it. The word vandalism, still used today for senseless destruction, traces its origin directly back to this event. What followed was, in its own way, sadder than any single battle. Between Valentinian's death in 455 and Odoacer's final takeover in 476, 9 different men held the Western throne, most of them installed and then discarded by whichever powerful general controlled the army at the time. Ricimer, the half-Suebi, half-Visigothic general mentioned earlier, personally made and unmade emperor after emperor during this period, treating the purple robe less like a sacred office and more like a useful puppet costume. One of those emperors, Majorian, briefly seemed capable of actually turning things around, rebuilding the fleet, reforming taxation, reclaiming lost territory in Gaul, before Ricimer, threatened by his competence, had him arrested and executed in 461 AD after barely 4 years on the throne. The lesson could not have been clearer to anyone still paying attention. By the 460s, competence itself had become dangerous for a Western Roman emperor to display. Part 4. The Quiet End. Then, finally, came the end. Not with glory, not with fire, with a sigh. In 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer decided he no longer needed to keep up the increasingly threadbare pretense. He deposed the young emperor, Romulus Augustulus, sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople as a symbolic gesture, and declared himself, simply, King of Italy. Not emperor, king. Because Odoacer understood something everyone around him already quietly knew, but had never quite been willing to say out loud in so many words. The title of Roman emperor in the West had, by that point, stopped meaning anything of real, tangible value. The Western Roman Empire did not end with some legendary cinematic final battle. It ended, almost anticlimactically, with a bureaucratic formality, a change of paperwork, a change of title, and barely a ripple across most of the empire's daily life. Now, you might reasonably assume that was simply it, that Rome vanished from history entirely at that exact moment. But here is the part of the story that so often gets left out entirely or rushed through far too quickly. Rome never actually fully fell. What collapsed in 476 was specifically its political structure in the western half of the empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, what modern historians now generally call the Byzantine Empire, kept going for nearly 1,000 more years after that supposedly final date. Constantinople still called itself Rome. Its emperors still proudly called themselves Romans, right up to the very end. Its legal system remained built directly on Roman law. Its administrative language stayed Latin for centuries, before gradually, naturally shifting over to Greek. Nearly 60 years after Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, one Byzantine ruler actually tried to reverse the whole disaster. The Emperor Justinian, crowned in 527 AD, dreamed openly of reuniting the old empire under a single throne once again. He very nearly pulled it off. His brilliant general Belisarius, commanding a comparatively small but highly disciplined army, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in 533 and 534, then pushed into Italy itself, recapturing Rome from the Ostrogoths after a grueling series of campaigns. For a brief, remarkable moment in the 550s, the Mediterranean world looked almost whole again, with a single emperor in Constantinople, nominally ruling territory stretching from Spain to the Persian frontier. It did not last. The wars of reconquest devastated Italy, far worse than the original barbarian settlements ever had, leaving cities like Rome even more depopulated than before. And then, in 541 AD, a pandemic now known as the Plague of Justinian swept through the eastern Mediterranean, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people across the empire and beyond over the following 2 centuries. Quite possibly the same bacterium responsible for the medieval Black Death, centuries earlier. Justinian's reconquered territories in Italy were lost again to a new wave of Lombard invaders within just a few years of his death, and the dream of a fully restored Rome died with him. Even so, what remained kept going, and going, for centuries longer than most people assume. Constantinople survived Arab sieges in the 7th and 8th centuries, weathered the loss of most of its eastern territory to the rise of Islam, endured the disaster of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when fellow Christians sacked the city instead of Muslim armies, and clung on, shrunken but unbroken, for another 2.5 centuries after that humiliation. When the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople for good in 1453, the Byzantines living inside those walls still, sincerely, considered themselves the rightful, unbroken heirs of ancient Rome, nearly 1,000 years after the West had already fallen. Back in the West, meanwhile, something equally interesting was quietly unfolding. The various barbarian kingdoms that rose up out of the ruins of the old empire did not, on the whole, reject Roman civilization outright. They tried in their own ways to inherit it wholesale. Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who came to rule Italy after Odoacer, worked hard and deliberately to preserve Roman laws, institutions, and even physical buildings under his new rule. Clovis, king of the Franks, converted specifically to Catholic Christianity in order to gain legitimacy among the heavily Roman population of Gaul he now governed. The Visigoths, who settled in Spain, adopted Latin language and Roman customs as their own, generation after generation, until the line between conqueror and conquered blurred almost completely. In a very real, very literal sense, the barbarians did not actually want to destroy Rome. They wanted, in their own way, to become Rome. Why would they want that so badly? Because Rome represented something no purely tribal kingdom could ever fully replicate on its own from scratch. Civilization, order, law, culture, in the broadest and deepest sense of that word. Germanic leaders across the former empire understood clearly that their own long-term legitimacy depended heavily on connecting themselves, however loosely, to that inherited Roman legacy. It is exactly why Charlemagne, king of the Franks, was formally crowned Roman emperor in the year 800, centuries after the West had supposedly fallen for good. It is why the Holy Roman Empire kept claiming, for nearly 1,000 years afterward, to be the rightful successor to ancient Rome. It is even why Russian tsars, many centuries later and thousands of miles away, took their very title from the old Latin word Caesar. Part 5. Why did Rome really fall? So why did Rome really fall? It's a question that has genuinely obsessed serious historians for centuries now, and it still doesn't have one single, universally agreed-upon answer. The 18th century historian Edward Gibbon, in his sprawling, monumental work on the subject, famously blamed Christianity for much of the decline. He argued, controversially, that the Christian faith gradually weakened Rome's old martial spirit, quietly turning warriors into monks and proud, ambitious citizens into humble believers, far more focused on the promise of heaven than on the messy, difficult business of defending their earthly homeland. Other historians, writing both before and after Gibbon, have pointed instead to purely economic factors, the runaway inflation we already discussed, the slow collapse of long-distance trade networks, the gradual exhaustion of the empire's precious metal mines. Some more recent historians focus heavily on environmental and biological causes instead. Devastating plagues like the Antonine Plague and the later plague of Cyprian, subtle climate shifts that quietly ruined harvests across entire regions for years at a stretch, diseases that wiped out significant portions of entire populations before anyone fully understood what was happening or why. One particularly memorable theory, popular for a while in the 20th century, blamed lead poisoning, pointing to the Roman elite's habit of using lead pipes for plumbing and lead-based sweeteners in wine, and suggesting this slowly degraded the judgment and fertility of the ruling class over generations. Most serious historians today treat this idea as, at best, a minor contributing factor rather than any kind of central cause. But it remains a genuinely fascinating illustration of just how many different angles scholars have tried approaching this question from over the centuries. The debate has not stayed still in recent decades either. Modern historians tend to split loosely into two camps. One group, sometimes called the catastrophists, led by scholars like Brian Ward Perkins, argues forcefully that the fall of Rome really was a genuine catastrophe, a violent, disruptive collapse that meaningfully reduced literacy, trade, urban life, and material living standards across Western Europe for centuries afterward, not some gentle changing of the guard. The other camp, sometimes called the transformationists, associated with historians like the late Peter Brown, argues instead that framing this period purely as decline and fall badly undersells the genuine creativity, adaptation, and cultural continuity of what came after, pointing to exactly the kind of barbarian kingdoms adopting Roman law and Christian bishops inheriting Roman administration that we've already discussed in this video. Both camps are looking at largely the same evidence. They simply disagree, sometimes fiercely, about whether the right word for what happened is collapse or transformation. But the deeper truth, and this is really the part you and I need to sit with for a moment, is that Rome fell for all of these reasons simultaneously, and for no single one of them in isolation. It was a slow, accumulative, self-reinforcing process in which every individual problem quietly fed directly into the next one down the line. The economy collapsed, so the state could no longer reliably pay its own soldiers on time. Unpaid soldiers rebelled or simply deserted. Rebellions triggered fresh rounds of civil war. Civil wars stripped soldiers away from the actual frontiers to fight each other instead. Weakened frontiers allowed new invasions to succeed where they once would have failed. Those invasions further destroyed what remained of the economy. And then the entire brutal cycle simply started all over again, a little worse each time. There is also one specific factor that rarely gets the full attention it genuinely deserves in most popular retellings of this story: the loss of North Africa. When the Vandals conquered the wealthy city of Carthage in 439 AD, they didn't just win a symbolic victory. They cut off, almost overnight, the massive grain supply that had fed the city of Rome itself for centuries. North Africa had long served as the literal breadbasket of the empire. Without it, Italy quite simply went hungry. And a starving empire, no matter how proud its history, is already very close to being a dying one. Let me give you a single number that puts the entire scale of this collapse into perspective all at once. In the year 100 AD, the city of Rome itself had somewhere around 1 million inhabitants, by far the largest, densest metropolis the ancient world had ever produced. By the year 500 AD, that same city's population had dropped to somewhere fewer than 20,000 people. The great avenues stood empty. The famous aqueducts fell into disrepair and ran dry in places. The public baths, once packed with citizens every single day, sat cold and abandoned. The Colosseum itself, where crowds of 50,000 once roared for their favourite gladiators, was, by this point, reportedly being used as a makeshift hideout by local criminal gangs hiding among its ruined arches. Rome, the so-called Eternal City, had quietly, almost unbelievably, become something close to a ghost town. The decline was not unique to the capital either. Across Western Europe, cities that had once housed tens of thousands of people shrank dramatically, or were abandoned altogether. Trade networks that had once moved fine pottery, wine, and manufactured goods across thousands of kilometers collapsed into small, localized economies where a village might rarely see a coin minted more than a few valleys away. Archaeological digs across the former western provinces consistently show the same pattern repeating itself in the 5th and 6th centuries. Smaller houses, cruder pottery, fewer imported goods, and building techniques that, in some regions, would not be matched again in sophistication for hundreds of years. Even the old Roman Senate, the institution that had, at least nominally, governed Rome since before the empire even existed, faded away with barely a whimper, continuing to meet in a reduced, largely ceremonial form for some decades after 476, before finally disappearing from the historical record entirely, sometime in the 6th century, its exact final session lost to time. And yet, and here is the real paradox sitting right at the heart of this entire story, Roman civilization itself did not die alongside the city's population. Part 6. The Empire that refused to disappear. The Catholic Church, which had gradually adopted much of the old administrative structure of the Roman state for its own purposes, became, almost by accident, the primary guardian of surviving Roman knowledge across Western Europe. Monasteries painstakingly preserved classical texts that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Bishops quietly took on governmental and judicial functions that had once belonged exclusively to Roman magistrates. In many meaningful ways, the Pope effectively became a kind of new emperor of Rome, not commanding armies but wielding a spiritual and administrative authority that still stretched, remarkably, across nearly the entire former territory of the old empire. Latin itself did not die either. It simply evolved, region by region, into the different local languages spoken across the old empire's western territories. Spoken, everyday Latin gradually transformed, over centuries, into what we now call the Romance languages: Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. Every single one of those modern languages is a direct, unbroken descendant of the Latin once spoken by ordinary Roman soldiers, merchants, farmers, and even enslaved people across the empire. When you speak English today, roughly 60% of your entire vocabulary traces directly back, either straight to Latin or indirectly through Norman French, which itself descended from Latin in turn. Rome, in a very real and literal sense, is sitting in your mouth every single time you open it to speak. Roman law survived as well, in a form still recognizable today. The Justinian Code, compiled in the 6th century under the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, carefully preserved core Roman legal principles and went on to become the foundational basis for the legal systems of virtually every country in Western Europe. Concepts like habeas corpus, the presumption of innocence, and the basic right to private property, all of them trace their origins directly back to Roman legal thinking. Your own rights, in a very real sense, were first written down in Rome, centuries before your country even existed as an idea. The physical structures outlasted political power just as thoroughly as the legal code did. Roman architecture, too, quietly shaped nearly every civilization that came after it. The arches, vaults, and domes that Roman engineers perfected over centuries were later adopted and adapted by Byzantine builders, by Islamic architects across the Mediterranean world, and eventually by Renaissance masters, rediscovering classical forms centuries later. The Pantheon in Rome, originally built in the 2nd century AD, still holds the world record for the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever constructed. 2,000 years later, it still makes trained modern engineers stop, stare, and quietly wonder how it was done at all. Smaller inheritances sit tucked into daily life in ways most people never stop to notice. The calendar hanging on your wall right now traces its structure directly back to reforms Julius Caesar introduced in 45 BC, later fine-tuned under Pope Gregory in the 16th century, but still built on the same basic Roman framework of 12 months, several of them still carrying the names of Roman gods and emperors: July for Julius Caesar, August for his successor Augustus. Roman numerals still appear on clock faces, in movie copyright dates, and in the naming of monarchs and Super Bowls alike, nearly 2,000 years after they stopped being anyone's everyday counting system. Even the concept of a republic governed by elected representatives, checks on executive power, and a written body of law owes an enormous conceptual debt to Roman political structures, however imperfectly the Romans themselves lived up to those ideals in practice. And so we finally arrive at an uncomfortable, genuinely fascinating question worth sitting with. Did Rome actually fall, or did it simply transform into something else entirely? When you look closely at medieval Europe, what you actually see is not the absence of Rome at all. It is Rome in disguise, wearing new clothes. The Germanic kingdoms that rose from the empire's ruins did not reject Roman identity outright. They competed with each other for the right to claim it as their own. Feudalism itself borrowed heavily from older Roman legal and administrative concepts. Medieval Christianity was thoroughly saturated with inherited Roman philosophy, Roman rhetoric, and Roman organizational structure. The very idea of Europe as a single, connected cultural space was born directly out of the long, gradual process of Romanization that had unfolded across centuries of imperial rule. Even after the Eastern Empire finally, truly collapsed in 1453, its legacy kept moving forward regardless. Byzantine scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest carried with them priceless manuscripts of Greek and Roman texts that had survived nowhere else in the world. When those manuscripts arrived in Italy, they helped ignite the Renaissance. The rediscovery of classical learning that followed transformed Europe from the ground up, giving birth to humanism, to modern science, and eventually to the Enlightenment itself. Every modern idea of individual freedom, rational inquiry, and civic responsibility that now forms the backbone of the modern world carries Roman fingerprints somewhere underneath it. Before we wrap this up, if you've made it this far and you're genuinely enjoying the channel, please take a second to subscribe. Documentaries like this one take real hours of research and writing behind the scenes, and every new subscriber genuinely helps keep this whole project alive and growing. Part 7. The Real Lesson of Rome. So what is the real lesson buried inside Rome's fall? What can you and I actually take away from the story of the greatest civilization the ancient world ever produced? One that ultimately collapsed under the accumulated weight of its own internal contradictions. First, no empire is truly permanent, no matter how invincible it might look at its absolute peak. Rome looked eternal from the inside. It was not. Second, greatness always arrives bundled together with responsibility. Rome managed, eventually, to conquer nearly the entire known world, but it could not, in the end, sustainably defend everything it had conquered forever. Third, and perhaps most importantly, internal corruption is consistently more dangerous to a civilization than any single outside enemy could ever be on its own. It was not, in the end, the barbarians alone who destroyed Rome. It was decades of civil war, runaway inflation, and the slow, quiet rot of institutions that were originally built to hold the entire system together. But there is a deeper lesson buried underneath all of that, one that rarely gets mentioned in most popular retellings of this story. Rome fell, at least in part, because it slowly stopped believing in itself. By the 5th century, there were remarkably few people left across the Western Empire who still genuinely thought of themselves as Roman, in any deep, meaningful sense. The legions were increasingly full of men who owed no real emotional loyalty to the idea of Rome at all. The emperors themselves had become little more than puppets, quietly controlled from behind the throne by powerful barbarian generals. The old Roman aristocracy had largely retreated to isolated, fortified country estates, effectively abandoning the cities to fend for themselves as best they could. Picture, for a moment, an ordinary farmer living on a Roman estate in Gaul around the year 450, and compare his world to the citizen we imagine standing in the Forum 3 centuries earlier. He likely still speaks a form of Latin. He still, in a technical legal sense, holds Roman citizenship. But the tax collector who visits his village now works for a local Gothic or Frankish warlord, as often as for any distant imperial official, and frankly, the difference has stopped mattering much to him either way, since both simply want to be paid, and both offer roughly the same amount of protection in return. He has likely never seen an emperor, never travelled further than the nearest market town, and has no particular reason to care whether the man ruling from Ravenna or Constantinople still calls himself Augustus. For him, and for millions like him scattered across the crumbling western provinces, the fall of Rome was not a single dramatic event at all. It was simply the slow, unremarkable background noise of an ordinary life, barely worth mentioning at the dinner table. Nobody, in the end, was particularly willing to die for Rome anymore, because Rome, as an idea worth sacrificing for, had quietly stopped meaning very much of anything to the people who were supposed to defend it. It had become an empty shell of a name, a hollow institution running almost entirely on inherited momentum and habit. And that, perhaps, is the real, uncomfortable tragedy sitting at the center of this entire story. Not that Rome was conquered from outside, but that it slowly, quietly surrendered from within. Not that its enemies were simply too strong for it in the end, but that Rome itself had gradually become too weak to care anymore. Because in the final accounting, what actually destroyed the most powerful empire in ancient history was not, primarily, a barbarian sword. It was the accumulated apathy of its own people. Consider, for a moment, how different this makes Rome's ending from the way we usually imagine great civilizations falling. There was no final decisive battle where Rome's fate was settled in an afternoon. There was no single villain whose ambition alone brought the whole structure down. There was instead a 500-year-long argument the empire kept having with itself about who deserved citizenship, about who should pay for defense, about which god or gods deserved loyalty, about how much power any one general or emperor should be trusted to hold. And somewhere along the way, the empire simply stopped winning that argument in its own favor. Every individual decision, taken on its own, might have seemed reasonable enough at the time. It was only centuries later, looking back at the whole accumulated pile of them, that the pattern became impossible to miss. But remember this, before you go. Even though the Roman Empire itself eventually fell, Roman civilization never truly died at all. Every single time you read a book, every time you walk through a city laid out on a grid, every time you stand up for your own basic legal rights, every time you use a word rooted somewhere deep in Latin, you are touching something that Rome left behind for you, whether you ever noticed it before or not. Its legacy is woven so completely into the fabric of the modern world that it has become nearly impossible to fully separate the two anymore. In that very real sense, Rome never actually fell. It simply changed shape, over and over again, for 1500 years and counting. 476 AD. A boy emperor is quietly removed from power without a single drop of blood being shed anywhere in the palace. The great doors close behind him for the last time. 1,000 years of continuous imperial history reach their formal, unglamorous end. But even as those old doors close, others are already opening elsewhere. The Middle Ages are beginning to take shape. Christianity is steadily consolidating its hold across the former Western world. Germanic peoples are busy building entirely new nations, one by one, directly on top of old Roman foundations. And out of the physical and political ruins of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever produced, slowly and painfully, an entirely new civilization begins quietly taking shape. One that will honor the deep past, even as it stumbles forward, uncertainly, toward its own future. That is the real, full story of how Rome actually fell. Not an ending, in the end, but a long, difficult transition. Not a clean death, but a slow, complicated transformation stretched across centuries. And if this story teaches us anything at all worth carrying forward, it is simply this. Even the greatest empires in human history eventually fall, but their ideas, their values, their culture, those can genuinely last for thousands of years afterward, long after the last legion has gone home for good. Rome fell 1500 years ago, and yet you and I are both still sitting here today, living inside a world quietly shaped by nearly everything it built, argued over, wrote down, and left behind. That, perhaps, is the purest form of immortality any civilization has ever actually achieved. This has been Deep History Origins. If this video made you think differently about how civilizations actually rise and fall, share it with someone else who loves history as much as you clearly do. Because stories like this one remind us exactly where we came from, and maybe, just maybe, where we might be headed next.